when we see water in the fields, standing water in the fields, the standard conclusion, is, from above, is that the soils are saturated. They're essentially at field capacity. In other words, they are full of water. And while to an extent that might be true, essentially the key point here is that when soils are dense, compacted, solid, essentially, it behaves like a solid. We actually dug into the soil underneath, what was sort of several inches of standing water, and the soil below that was dry. Yeah, directly below, probably sort of between 2 and 4 or 6 inches of standing water after, 3 months of extended rain, it was still dry. Good aggregated soil has good porosity, so it allows water to pass through, and that means the water no longer just sits at the surface after a rain event or during winter, for example. Essentially, there's somewhere for the water to go apart from just sitting there and making it lie wet, for days and days, weeks and months, for example. But it also means that there's water now still in the soil when it does get hot and dry again in the summer. So essentially, we're banking water. We're putting water, essentially into the bank. We're putting it into our savings account, essentially, from where it can then be drawn upon by crops and forages when it gets hot in the summer, basically.
Welcome to another episode of We Are Carbon. I'm Helen Fisher, and you've just heard from our guest, Niels Corfield, who is here to address one of the most visual impacts of our changing landscape here in the UK. It's hard to not have noticed the increase in standing water across farmlands in recent years. Fields that appear to contain vast lakes during our wetter seasons. With water knowing no boundaries, this causes concern both within our food supply and well beyond. And whilst we might consider the weather to be changing and causing this, today's conversation helps to underline why in fact the cause and solution to the standing water is much more within our control. Soil health is the starting point for many of the topics on this podcast, and it's no exception here. As you've heard getting touched on right at the start there, the way that land is managed plays a huge role in the soil's ability to infiltrate and hold on to water, which impacts all parts of the farm's production and resilience. I'm delighted that Niels offers so much more knowledge in this conversation based on his course, Weatherproof Your Farm. You'll find links in the description to learn more about that, and of course, don't forget to subscribe to keep up to date with more from We Are Carbon. And for now, let's get stuck in.
So my work is as an independent farming advisor and trainer, and I work nationally, both one-to-one and with groups, helping farmers to adopt regenerative and soil health practices.
Fantastic, and something that's so important at the minute, something that is, that learning journey to transform the way that people farm from it's quite potentially an extreme change, but obviously needs to be integrated in a practical way that can be moving them forward in steps that they're comfortable with and available and ready for. So this is a really interesting topic to get into some of that sort of nitty-gritty of how that change can take place, but also looking at some of the really important reasons that people need to readdress the way that they're managing the land across the country. And it's something that you have spent a lot of time taking a look at, something that from a point of view of a non-farmer, and I think a lot of the people in the sort of outside of the farming community are taking awareness more so over the last couple of years as we look around and the changes in the weather are changing the landscape, and we see a lot of water sitting on the fields, and we hear a lot of conversations in the news about the challenges that farmers are having with obtaining a crop, and a lot of that because of the weather, and the weather being the problem that they're having to deal with. And the concept that you are putting forward is the idea of a weatherproof farm, that in fact the weather doesn't have to be the thing that is blamed for why we aren't having stable crops and stable food supply. So I think it's a really important conversation, even for people that aren't farming, to understand why regenerative practices are so important to support all of us in our food supply. So thank you very much for joining us. And I think it's a really good place to start would be to look at how you've put this concept together, and where does it come from, and what are you basing it on?
Yeah, thanks, Helen. So essentially, this idea of the Weatherproof Farm very much comes from my monitoring work. So I've now monitored over 200 farms right across the UK, looking at both soil and pasture health. And I can say from that sort of direct in-field observation work that poor soil health and poor pasture health is probably one of the key threats to production on all farming operations across the country.
Yeah, so the soil itself, that's kind of where it all starts, that poor soil. So why is the soil itself not outside of the farmer's control? Because when we sort of touch on just a basic understanding of farming, we know that, well, maybe if you've got very heavy soil, then you've got a problem that you can't necessarily have in your own control. Or if you've got very sandy soil, or you've got waterlogged soil, all of these things feel like an outside element that isn't in somebody's control. So how can we reframe that and say that poor soil is something that people can be empowered to change?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think you're right that there's a sort of pervasive feeling that, I've got what I've got, it is what it is. I'm sort of either blessed or cursed with what I've got. And while it's true, different underlying geological factors do create different soil types, and that there is a difference there. Again, when we're talking about soil health, that essentially transcends soil type, essentially, and you can have a healthy, heavy soil and unhealthy, heavy soil, essentially. And one of the sort of observation practices or strategies that any producer or any land manager or landowner can use is to do sort of in-field assessments. I use a spade test or infiltration rate test, for example, and then go to the edge of the field along a similar sort of level, if you like, about the same altitude, and repeat those same tests at the sort of margin. So it could be at the fence line, or it could be just over the wall. It could be on the verge. It could be next to the hedge, for example. Again, whatever you've got access to, and then compare those two. And essentially in that situation, 9 times out of 10, you're looking at the same soil type. You're also looking at the same climate, essentially, same rainfall, same altitude, so essentially those factors that are outside of our control are eliminated. And what we're left with is management, fundamentally. And what we see when we do these kinds of tests, and we do let these sort of tests play out over sort of extended periods, for example, in the field, even on quite light land, we can see results where we're abandoning infiltration rate tests after 40 minutes, for example, or as long as 6.5 hours, where I have actually done this, for extended periods, where we're able to infiltrate half an inch in 6.5 hours in the field. Up against the fence, we could infiltrate a full inch of water in 8 minutes. Other examples are, test abandoned in the field, 40 minutes or more, for example, and then we're infiltrating in just a few seconds at the headland. And again, that can be in the middle of winter as well, even when ostensibly, it's a very wet period, if you like. And we certainly saw that this winter, for example, that playing out, examples of ground that were monitored in March in the northwest of England, including land that's quite light, and in the farmer's own sort of estimations, even though they're in the northwest of England and sort of southwest of Scotland, in their own estimation, we're never more than 3 weeks away from a drought. And yet, when we do this sort of tests in the field again, the water just sort of sits there in the ring. I mean, it's sort of slightly perhaps perverse to do those tests when you've actually got standing water in the field. But essentially, we've got standing water in the field, and then we go and do an infiltration rate test next to the hedge, for example, or under the fence. We're able to infiltrate a full inch of water in just a few seconds. Again, in the middle of March, after the wettest winter on record in the northwest of England.
Yeah, so this is really very, very powerful stuff, because what you're describing is that the soil type is exactly the same in both situations, but that within the field itself, because of the way that it's managed and farmed, the water is standing, or it simply won't infiltrate. But the absence of management, if you like, and just leaving it to have a hedgerow or some simple bit of nature even on the edge of the land, the same soil can infiltrate very, very quickly at all times through the year. So obviously for growing, it's imperative, whether you're talking about the extreme of drought or the extreme of lots and lots of rain, and you're having that benefit or that disbenefit on either ends of the weather extreme. So what's actually happening that assists water to infiltrate into soil? We hear about this term aggregation, and that the aggregation is the thing that the farmer should be aiming for. But what actually is it, and why is it so important?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, essentially, if you want to sort of describe the structure of the soil, I mean, essentially, when we're talking about soil health, essentially, we're talking about soil structure. If you want to boil it down to its sort of essence, if you like. And we can kind of say that sort of good soil health and poor soil health are sort of two ends of the of a spectrum, if you like, two sides of the same coin. And essentially, soil that's in poor health, with the exception of very light and very stony soils, for all other soil types, if they're in poor soil health, they're compacted, essentially. Effectively, because there's nothing sort of holding them open, and if there's nothing holding the soil open, it just sort of settles back and collapses into its dense, kind of solid, kind of mineral state, if you like. On the other end of the spectrum, essentially, when soil is in good health, it's aggregated, which essentially is crumb structure. Quite literally, soils are sort of glued together. Small soil particles are glued together into separate, disparate soil particles or crumbs or aggregates, which is the technical term, by biology. I think that's the key thing here. So essentially, biology is producing sticky substances, biotic glues, that are binding together these disparate soil particles into crumbs. And once you have soil particles that are quite large, essentially, and of differing sizes, you now have a structure that's, rather than it being sort of packed and solid and dense, it's now open and loose. And you can feel it underfoot, for example, when you're walking across the soil, it feels sort of springy and spongy underfoot. And when you put the spade into it, for example, there's much less resistance to the spade when you're putting it into the ground, possibly with the exception of the sort of the roots at the surface potentially, but actually sort of the passage of the metal into the ground is much less impeded. But essentially what that translates to is that loose structure now has porosity. It's got open spaces within the soil, so it allows water to percolate in, essentially like it would do with coffee grounds, for example. And again, the sort of the opposite of that essentially is if your soils lack aggregate structure, they sort of settle back into a dense, compacted or solid structure. I think that's the important thing to say here. And I think what's interesting is when we see water in the fields, standing water in the fields, the standard conclusion, is, from above, is that the soils are saturated. They're essentially at field capacity. In other words, they are full of water. And while to an extent that might be true, essentially the key point here is that when soils are dense, compacted, solid, essentially, it behaves like a solid, and we rarely use the terms absorption, infiltration, porosity when relating to a solid. Essentially the way the solids interact with water is by displacing it. Yeah, solids displace water. They don't absorb water because they can't. They don't have an internal space, for that water to pass into. It's only a sponge or other sort of, foam type structures that allow water to pass into them and through them. And so it is with the soil. So good aggregated soil has good porosity, so it allows water to pass through. And that means that water no longer just sits at the surface after a rain event or during winter, for example. Essentially, there's somewhere for the water to go apart from just sitting there and making it lie wet, for days and days, weeks and months, for example. But it also means that there's water now still in the soil when it does get hot and dry again in the summer. So essentially, we're banking water. We're putting water, essentially into the bank. We're putting it into our savings account, essentially, from where it can then be drawn upon by crops and forages when it gets hot in the summer, basically.
Yeah, it's creating a really interesting visual, I think, that helps to get past some of that misconception, the idea that people think that the water is laying on the top because you've got a container that's absolutely reached its capacity. But instead, it's more like what you're describing, that you've got an empty container with a solid lid on the top. And when the rain stops coming down, actually, there isn't anything stored underground. But when it comes down a lot, it just sits at the surface. And I think the sort of description of it, like it's just this compacted mineral layer, it feels to me a little bit like the soil has been turned into that sort of clay pond lining that can be used to literally create a water holding vessel. So if the farming practices are creating that, and you describe the solution as being biological, that the sponge and the capillaries and the aeration within the soil that allows the infiltration, it's coming from biology. This then is all about the way that the land is managed and how that biology is supported so that it can be maintained. So could you help us to understand this in a kind of real life context through some case studies that you've experienced where those extremes have been overcome through transforming the practice on the land? And if we perhaps acknowledge that this isn't something that is for one specific farming type, maybe we could look at a couple of examples. So I'd love it if you could start us off with maybe a dairy case study where the problem of the waterlogged and compacted soil has been overcome.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the thing to say at this stage is it's quite early days with quite a bit of this work. So there aren't many people that have really sort of, got into the sort of the meat of it. I think that essentially, we're still at that point where, people are sort of starting to acknowledge these factors and starting to make the link between production costs, for example, and soil health. So if we look at the dairy context, for example, it'd be fairly typical for people to be housing for 6 months of the year, for example, and that's just, regarded as sort of normal. You might say that in some cases it's a little bit less, particularly on lighter land, more sandy land, for example, but you could say that might be the average, particularly as dairies tend to be sort of in the west of the country, which is generally sort of higher rainfall overall. So essentially the kind of, the reason why we're housing is because the land is lying wet. And if we kept the animals out, it would poach and, there would be an animal welfare impact, for example. There'd be a production impact in terms of their yield, for example. So we bring them in. And that, is probably the lion's share of the cost in a sort of grazing operation, sort of livestock operation, is that wintering cost, essentially. So essentially the kind of the potential there for us is to reduce housing periods, essentially, and potentially reduce them quite significantly. And while again, I can't necessarily point to sort of specific data on that front. I would say that, people that are getting more into the sort of regenerative grazing kind of world essentially do see housing periods reduced. And even just looking at sort of, grass production, we should also see grass continuing to grow for longer into the winter. So we're not only shortening the housing period or extending the grazing season, we're also extending the growing season. So essentially there's sort of real opportunities to reduce costs around wintering. But then, when it comes to sort of summer production and production in droughts, again, if we refer to data like AHDB's Forage for Knowledge or Grass Check GB, they aggregate dairy production, grass production, in this case, grass yield, across the whole country and report on that data. And if we look at the 2018 drought, the 2020 drought, and the 2022 drought, we can see that sort of writ large in the data. Essentially, there's just a massive hole in the data. 2018 is a really good example. Essentially, we went from about sort of 80 kilos a day of grass production, additional grass growth, essentially, down to 20 kilos a day. And I think that what's important to say is that that's sort of aggregated across the whole country. So, there's still parts of the country, like the Northwest, for example, which weren't nearly so sort of heavily affected. So they're actually sort of lifting the numbers. Whereas truthfully, a good proportion of the country, like in 2022, production essentially went down to zero. So in that situation, we're having to, offer bales or stored feed, like clamp silage, for example, that should be there for winter, but we're having to offer it out in summer. So I guess, again, the sort of the key opportunity here is that, effectively, when it does get hot and dry, we should be producing more grass, not less. Yeah, these should be by far and away our most productive times of the year because, essentially heat and sun drive growth better than anything out of a bag. Yep. But so long as water is not a limiting factor, it's one of the few truths in agricultural practices across all farming types is crops that are grown in greenhouses or polytunnels, for example, out yield the same crop grown in the field. Yeah, and that's because you've raised the temperature artificially with that cover. Yeah, so higher temperatures stimulate more vegetative growth and earlier fruiting, essentially. But you better remember to turn on the irrigation, otherwise you're going backwards fast. Yeah, and that essentially is why the northwest of England had, and the southwest of Scotland, obviously, had their best year in 2022 because they had the elevated temperatures and they had the more sunny days, the more cloudless days, so more kind of solar gain, essentially, more access to, sunlight, essentially. And they had the little rain events, little half-inch rain event every sort of 4 to 5 weeks, if you like, just when it was getting dicey. So, they really benefited from that. But again, it's the heat and the sun that's, driving the growth. So the more that we retain water in winter, I mean, essentially, again, it still rains heavily in the winter. The more we store that water in the soil, the more it will be there to essentially drive growth when it gets hot. And, effectively, we should be breaking records during those periods because it's like somebody taking our farm, sticking a greenhouse over it and shoving it 2 degrees further south for free. But again, so long as water's not a limiting factor.
Yeah, this is really interesting then. So it sounds like a vicious cycle that's being created by taking the animals off the soil, and housing them is increasing the costs, but then at the same time as doing that, you're taking the biology and the action of the cow off the land, and potentially that absence and kind of treating the land in a different way is making the need for the housing increase. And I think that it's interesting you've brought in the pricing here, the costs. It is such a fundamental part of the whole equation, is how the way that we treat the land is supporting the farmer and the people that are acting upon the land. And I suppose this is one of the biggest turning points. If the soil health is depleting and becoming so challenged in different weather types, as the weather actually does become more unpredictable, then it becomes that sort of scenario where change isn't an option. It actually is a necessity. So it's really important, I suppose, for more and more people to get up and ahead of this knowledge as soon as possible. So if soil health is obviously very integral to all farming, how would we look at that in an arable context?
Yeah, so under the arable, in the arable context, again, the examples, for example, that we witnessed this winter, and I think that probably the sector that was hardest hit, probably between all the different farming types, was the arable sector. Again, because of that low-lying land, much sort of closer to water courses, for example, much sort of flatter, and much more reliant on sort of drainage for essentially for winter crops, both to get winter crops established, but then also to keep them through the winter. And I think that there was, quite a large number of farms that either didn't get winter crops in or had to re-drill, so they've got double the cost with establishment. Many of which just didn't sort of make it through the winter. Land was lying wet for long periods, essentially, so they were just sort of rotting off. Or, and again, sort of the more extreme cases where they were actually inundated, which is obviously not really something that they can do anything about. But essentially, a sea change done throughout the farming community will significantly reduce the severity and longevity of inundation events sort of downstream. So even if you're not sort of a lowland farmer, making changes to your farming practices will not only help the people out that are living in the houses down in the valleys, for example, but also the lowland farmers that are sort of receiving, sort of 70% of the rainfall as runoff from sort of nearby land or land from sort of more in the uplands, if you like. And I think what was really interesting is, or telling, you might say, we did a site visit to some low-lying land, sort of long-term arable operation, in this case in South Yorkshire. So pretty heavy land, drained land, so flat, low-lying, and sort of large areas of standing water in that whole area. But what's really interesting is that we sort of did a couple of fields side by side, and the field that had been under sort of conventional management, probably sort of 15 years or so, under sort of arable cropping. There was standing water in the field and sort of very muddy boots as you sort of walk out. But we actually dug into the soil underneath, what was sort of several inches of standing water, and the soil below that was dry. Yeah, directly below, probably sort of between 2 and 4 or 6 inches of standing water after, 3 months of extended rain, it was still dry. And I think it's also worth just iterating that the drains weren't, or the ditches weren't overtopped either. So there was no sort of water sort of backing up into the field or kind of, sort of overtopping and sort of, encroaching into the field. The drains, the ditches certainly had water in them, but they were nowhere near being overtopped, essentially. But then, directly across the ditch, a field that in this particular case had been down to grass for 4 years, had no standing water and no muddy boots. But again, I think it's important not to think of that as a prescription, and to think that you sort of, all solutions derive from specific sort of silver bullets, if you like, but to understand that, again, the observation here, and it all starts with observation, is that, these two fields are the same soil type. Yeah, just divided by, a small feature, a ditch in this case, and yet we see radically different conditions. So essentially, again, we'll come back to that same point that it's not the soil type, it's not the weather, it's the soil health, and it's the management fundamentally that is determining whether the soil is in a high health state. And in that case, it would be, in the arable case, no muddy boots, no standing water, essentially, or in a poor health state, in which case you're talking about sort of very sticky, muddy boots, and lots of standing water with dry soil underneath.
It's really interesting listening through, because I know how complex this topic can be. The idea of stepping into a new method on your farm, particularly if you've been taught for, following generational information and knowledge and practice. And the idea of trying to do something new is not easy. And then you step into it and it's so different. Thinking about the terminology and the mindset of regenerative agriculture versus the conventional, more prescriptive plan, it isn't easy at all. And as you've said, there's no silver bullet, which makes it even more difficult. People would love to just go, right, tell me what to do and I'll do it. But it's not that straightforward. But what you're bringing actually is something, I think, that is digestible and understandable, because you're taking all the complexity out of that and saying it doesn't matter what your situation is. You don't need to feel disempowered that you've got the wrong soil type or that the weather's out of control and therefore you're going to fail anyway. It's saying you can do something about it. And then you're putting that into this framework that says, yeah, there's a lot to this. There's a lot of layers to this, and there's a lot of learning to go through. But think about the soil. Think about the way that the soil's infiltrating water. And by just putting your focus there, I think people can get quite clearly in their mind a sense of why the way that they're previously going about things isn't offering the results, but that they are possible. I think it's a very lovely thing that you've put together in terms of the focus and the understanding. So really, in summary, what you're bringing across is this sort of idea that you're not at the mercy of outside factors, but that soil health is the key player here, and that it's really soil health is offering resilience in extreme weathers also, so that as things do likely become more extreme, that's not going to be something that we can't overcome.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I think probably the key thing that I would sort of add here, if you like, for the farmer, the land manager, the landowner as well, essentially, is the soil doesn't lie. Yeah. If you want to, if you want to convince yourself whether a particular practice or intervention is effective or not, you can evidence that yourself, either sort of like in the immediate term or in the short term. And it isn't necessarily something that needs to take sort of years and years to happen. It doesn't need a bit of paper just to convince, a third party or the government that you're doing the right thing. Essentially, you have the ability to inform yourself by sort of entering into a sort of like, a conversation, if you like, with the land, basically. And the land will always tell you the truth. Yeah, it's not going to lie. It's not going to sort of, equally, it's not going to big you up. If you're feeling like necessarily you want just sort of, a pat on the back, but if you genuinely have made an improvement, it will, in most cases, sort of actually sort of report that.
Yeah, that's what I'm picking up. I think the idea that you don't have to wait for sending off soil samples to a lab to explore, which is obviously a huge part of the nitty gritty and understanding your land, but that you can get a spade and have a look yourself and look at the way that you can be self-informed and immediately informed of this is where I'm at today. I think that's very beneficial, because people need that. They need to be able to connect through their own observations as opposed to always, looking at something outside. So thank you for bringing this. I think it's really important. And if we go another layer deeper, it would be really helpful to learn a little bit about the solution itself and the way that people can understand how they might change the management on the land.
Yep, absolutely. So the way that I've sort of condensed the advice, if you like, or the solutions is into sort of four main headings. And essentially we put sort of management at the top of the list because, again, we've sort of identified, and you yourselves, the farmer themselves can basically convince themselves through these sort of side-by-side monitoring assessments that management is at the heart of it. Essentially, it is the primary cause of the issues that we're dealing with day to day. Long housing periods, drought, poor establishment, for example, of crops, essentially, they're all reducible to management factors. And again, it's that idea that, prevention is better than cure. So we can talk about that sort of separately, but we'd also add to that we're not limited to that. Once we're in progress with good practice and management, then essentially we'd look to also include complementary interventions like mechanical, mineral, and biological, or sort of diversity type interventions to sort of complement that management change, essentially.
Fantastic. So if we looked at the that sort of management segment that you put at the top there, the prevention is better than the cure. What would be some key highlights out of that people might want to look into further?
Yeah. So essentially, if we break it into sort of grazing and cropping separately, if we looked at grazing first and foremost, essentially, we'd say that sort of predominantly the kind of historic management practices that we are concerned about would be grazing management, particularly, but also the use of vet meds and fertilizer practices, if you like. Nutrition management practices also has an impact, but probably the most important thing here is how we graze grass, how we and that's the specifics of grazing management practice, essentially. So, typically people may well be set stocking the land, so animals stay in a field for a number of days or weeks, for example. And essentially the issue in that situation is that animals, where they remain in an area for an extended period, the grasses that they grazed on day one, generally the most sort of palatable and tasty grasses, basically, they will start to regrow, at perhaps day 3, day 4, something like that, depending on what time of the year you're in. And again, if the animal has access to those plants, they will return to those plants, and they will preferentially graze those over the sort of 3-day-old, 2-day-old plants, essentially, that they have, essentially rejected. They'll take the most palatable plants and then gradually work down to the less palatable plants until there's regrowth on those sort of day one plants, and then they'll regraze that day one plant. And that can happen sort of a number of times within a set stocking event, for example. And what happens in that situation is that essentially the energy that's grown the leaf after those first few days of growth came from the roots. Because again, you remove the leaf, you remove the plant's ability to photosynthesize. So essentially the plant has to exchange that energy from the roots into the leaf. And then if it's grazed, then essentially that energy is removed. So it's a net energy loss from the plant. And that causes the roots to size down. Essentially the plant can no longer maintain a large root mass. So it essentially sizes down and becomes bonsaied. Quite literally becomes bonsai, just like a tree, sort of mature oak tree that's sort of 2 foot tall in a glass case, is genetically no different from that sort of standard oak growing in the hedge. The difference is a pruning regime, essentially, and a pruning regime, pruning the roots and pruning the leaf, essentially can cause a tree that would otherwise be sort of 30 or 40 foot tall, for example, to size down to just 3 foot tall, for example. So exactly the same process is happening in pasture if that is repeated sort of year on year. So that's sort of step one, if you like, is to remove that process of overgrazing. Essentially, we can think of set stocking as a management practice as essentially the primary form of overgrazing. The animals are staying in pasture for too long. So, essentially that would be sort of step one. under the grazing heading, if you like. But that also points to the sort of key aspect that is actually driving aggregation and soil health, and that is roots. It's really only dense roots, dense matted roots, for example, for sort of weeks or months as a minimum, that are generating aggregate structure. So dense roots that are extended downwards, deep dense roots, are what fundamentally are driving improved aggregation. So whatever method you use, any practice essentially that stimulates root growth or increases root mass, and that's important that we're not just talking about rooting depth, we're talking about rooting mass here. Any intervention that improves root mass will have a knock-on effect on aggregation. Essentially, where roots go, aggregation follows. So that essentially as a précis, if you like, for what we can do in the arable context, or the priorities in the arable context. So, I mean, essentially, we're already at a little, potentially, you might say, at a bit of a disadvantage in the arable context, because we haven't got that sort of permanent cover, if you like. We are growing annuals and they are being changed over. So I think, we're not going to sort of like imagine that it's should be sort of viewed in the same through the same lens, if you like. But essentially, we're looking to ensure that we're growing decent roots, for example. So we can look at in a cropping system, moving away from soil applied nutrition, and moving more towards nutrition by need, for example. So not over applying nutrients, because essentially that kind of causes the plant to become quite lazy. Also, soil applied nitrogen, for example, also acts as a drag on microbial activity. It suppresses microbial activity, and it also suppresses plant and biological interactions, essentially that process of root exudation. So it makes the plants lazy, essentially, and because the plants are lazy, then they're not essentially investing in biology. They're not investing energy into the soil. So, those organisms then go to sleep, essentially. So moving to sort of foliar nutrition for plants wherever possible, for example, applying nitrogen with a carbon source to sort of buffer the form of the nitrogen that's going down, or moving to more efficient forms of nitrogen, so we're putting less. All of those will have a knock-on effect in biological activity, root growth, for example. But then also we can look at materials that stimulate root growth. I call them root booster nutrients. So there's different nutrients, for example, phosphorus, sulfur, boron, as well as particular bacteria, for example, or amino acids that have now good evidence that they stimulate root growth, basically. So again, we can look at that as a way to sort of improve the root mass of our existing crops.
Thank you. I really appreciated listening through to that, because there are so many really helpful ways that you put things across. I love the idea of the grass becoming a bonsai, because that puts something in mind that I hadn't really quite had put across in that way before. And I love it when I kind of hear things like that. So the grazing holistically and managing grazing in this different system, I have obviously come across a lot and had a lot of conversations about this, but you put this across in a way that I think is very accessible to understand why the benefits come when you actually restrict the access and put all of the grazing animals in a smaller area for a short period of time. And that idea that you're not allowing them to just favour a particular plant, because that then is going to become over-pruned and become bonsai'd. I really appreciate that. I think it makes it very clear, because somehow it is a little... it's the opposite of what you think in your mind. If an ant, you think the best thing to do is give them lots and lots of space, and to switch and understand why bringing them into that condensed area and then moving them on quickly is actually the better way. You've really hit that home for me, so thank you. And it also highlights, I think, for people that understanding, put your mind into the root system and what's going on underground. That helps to identify why, we've turned the animals themselves into the enemy in a lot of climate discussions, but that actually why that can be the best way to have that permanent pasture and those perennial root systems far more beneficial for the climate than having the annual crops and everybody being completely dependent upon grains and vegetable matter. To have that mixed and diverse diet can actually be one of the best options that we have to go forward. And I think you've really hit that home, so thank you. If we look a little bit about some of the complementaries that you mentioned, is there anything within that you feel is really helpful to bring forward?
Yeah, so I think that essentially with many of these sort of approaches, they're not necessarily new, but I think sort of often sort of historically things like mechanical interventions, so subsoiling, slitting, essentially have been used essentially as remedial interventions. Essentially they're there to reset or undo damage that was done during the sort of management period, if you like. But the feeling from sort of our end, if you like, is that we can use them as transition tools. That essentially most soils are compacted, if not all soils are compacted. I would actually say all are actually. And while roots and root growth is what we're ultimately aiming for, and management is the primary lever, that's where the production comes from. Essentially, all these other interventions, they're a cost. Essentially, the production comes from the management ultimately. But it can take time to assimilate the sort of the management knowledge, if you like. Perhaps that's where more of the complexity lies. That's also where quite a lot of the subtlety lies, if you like. That sort of reading the land, reading the year, if you like. And it also might take some time to sort of implement infrastructure, for example. So there may well be a lag time under the management heading. Or also, for example, in some contexts, we may not have as much wiggle room or as much opportunity to pull the management lever as we might in other contexts. So, for example, your dairy cow, your high-performing dairy cow, for example, can't graze the same kind of grass that a suckler native beef cow can, for example. And while we certainly have the opportunity to pull genetics levers and make adjustments to breed selection, culling policies, essentially, the thinking here essentially is that we want to offer strategies that give that best practice management a bit of a leg up, essentially. We're not limited to any one intervention alone. And again, we are probably in most cases starting from a fairly low base point. So let's look at some, sort of kind of springboard interventions, if you like. So mechanical interventions would be things like subsoiling, slitting, airworks, roller slitting, and they either work from a shatter or cutting a slit into the ground, if you like. So they're relieving compaction physically. The important thing with those types of interventions is that they are done in the correct, or rather the correct implement is used in the correct weather window, because it's perfectly possible to either get a null result or to go backwards in extreme cases. And that's why it's important to do your due diligence with, spading the ground, looking to see if the ground's dry enough, essentially to accept the equipment. So we're looking for smearing or polishing in the ground. That would indicate that the ground's too wet, essentially. But, once we have satisfied ourselves, again, through direct observation, not through just assumption, but through that direct observation, then I think what the suggestion is, you're going to go forward and do, a small treatment. Again, get the spade out and just double check that you are where you think you are, you're getting the results you think you're getting, or that you assume you're getting. And again, we want to move away from that sort of faith-based approach and more to the empirical approach. So evidence any intervention, if you like, And then if we're happy that it's sort of passed both of those stages, then go forward and treat the remainder of the area or field, for example. But what's critical is that we're leaving a control strip, a small area of land that's marked that has been untreated. And then we can come back in a few weeks' time or a few months' time as well, potentially, and we can use our infiltration rate tests again to evidence success. And we should see a difference in infiltration. If not, then we would say, potentially wrong kit, wrong time, or wrong matchup. Because again, we're looking to make that matchup between soil type, weather window, and equipment, basically. So we could look at mechanical interventions as one class. Then we can also look at mineral interventions that might be applying gypsum or lime, for example. And I think what's nice there is we can do a jar test. In this case, we can take a pinch of product, put that into one jar, use a distilled water, put like an inch cube of soil into each jar from the field that you want to assess, grind them up or shake them up, for example, to get them in suspension, and then just leave them to settle for a period of time. And what we are looking for is a pronounced settling relative to the untreated example, and that indicates efficacy of a gypsum type product, for example, on that soil.
Thank you. Again, this it's very well thought through and very practical, the way that you're putting the information across. And so it sounds like these complementaries, you're putting them forward in a well managed for risk, and you're evidencing everything. So people again can start to understand why the decisions are being made and how the decisions are being made and how the land is responding to those. It's a very nice way for somebody to step into a new management style without it feeling like it's at the external knowledge that is guiding everything. It's kind of like the land manager themselves are integrating the knowledge as the land is learning, they are learning. And that's very essential for that resilience in the future, because adapting and continually changing is so much a part of things alongside. I really appreciate the way that you've shared this information. I think that we're at this stage where so many people are becoming aware of the problems, and I can't imagine from a farmer's point of view, if the land is becoming more difficult to work every year, how that kind of pushes you into a position that's very, very challenging. And when you step into a world of learning new, it can come across in ways that are inaccessible. It might feel a little bit like you just got to put your faith into something and hope. Or maybe a lot of information's put across and it's very dogmatic and you've got to do everything perfect and understand it exactly. And what you're doing, I feel, is you're paving a transition instead. You're giving information in a way that I have found very accessible to understand. And I feel that it is wonderful for people. I feel like, it's a short conversation in the scope of the content that we've covered. And yet I feel that people could come to this fresh-eyed, fresh-eared and think, yeah, I understand better now why I need to change my practice and what those steps forward will be. And I think that's really, really powerful stuff, because it is a time when this is so relevant to so many people, including all of us that eat food. Because if the farmers are struggling, then we're all going to see the consequence of that. So I really very much value that you've shared your information here today and that knowledge and given that accessibility to it. Is there a way that people can continue to learn? And do you have any other suggestions for them to look into?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So there's a couple of opportunities, I would say. The first one, sort of low-hanging fruit, if you like. You could attend one of my Weatherproof Farm courses at Farm Ed, and that's open sort of to a national audience, and that's on the 17th of September. But otherwise, perhaps if you want to do something locally and you participate in a farming cluster, for example, or a member of farming group, then I can come to you basically and deliver a sort of full workshop, basically, where we sort of go through the case in detail, and then we go through the advice in detail, and then we go into the field and we do a group monitoring exercise in small groups where you essentially can have a go at this same kind of monitoring and observation process, and then sort of finish off with a discussion as to how to improve the soil in that particular context, for example. So yeah, get in touch.
Fantastic, thank you. I'll make sure that all of that information is available so people can directly look in the description and head out and learn more. So on the 17th of September, there's an opportunity to learn directly.
Yep.
And people come to you for that one.
Yes, that's at Farm Ed. Yep.
Perfect. And then any other opportunities, they can reach out to you and arrange. So that's, wonderful. Thank you so much for your time and best of luck with everything.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for listening to this episode of We Are Carbon. You can find links in the description to explore more from Niels and the learning opportunities that he mentioned. Don't forget to subscribe to keep up to date with new content from We Are Carbon. And let's keep figuring this all out together.